I shall never lose hope, and my people shall never lose hope. In fact, we expect that the work will go on.
In Africa's fight for liberation from colonialism and apartheid, there were many great women who played important and indispensable roles. Unfortunately, these courageous female leaders have not received much recognition despite the fact that their selfless efforts were crucial in liberating many African countries. The aim of this video is to highlight these heroines of Africa's fight for liberation, as they deserve the same level of recognition and respect as African heroes such as Kwame Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela. The first great African woman everyone needs to know about is Nigeria's Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, a pioneering nationalist who fought against British colonialism and also was a leading advocate of women's rights in Nigeria. Affectionately referred to as the Mother of Africa, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was tireless in her campaigns for Nigeria's independence and most prominently for women's economic, social and political rights. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was a key member of one of the political parties that worked to attain independence for Nigeria. This party was the National Council for Nigeria and the Cameroons, which later became the National Convention of Nigerian Citizens. This was also the party of the man who became the first president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe. In 1947, Azikiwe selected her as the representative of Nigerian women for a delegation that traveled to London to meet the colonial authorities. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was the sole woman in the delegation. Ultimately, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was eventually one of the delegates who negotiated Nigeria's independence with the British government. Beyond her contributions to the struggle for Nigeria's independence, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was at the forefront of the fight against the oppression and exploitation of women in Nigeria. In 1944, she founded the Abeokuta Ladies Club, which later became the Abeokuta Women's Union, an organization that was committed to defending women's political, social, and economic rights. This organization became one of the most important women's movements of the 20th century and had a membership of over 20,000 women. The core objective of the Abeokuta Women's Union was fighting against the arbitrary exercise of colonial power by the British authorities and their local puppets. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti led several protests and campaigns by women to fight against unjust taxes and also for the right to vote, amongst other issues. For instance, in 1949, she led a protest against the native authorities, in particular the Alake of Egba land, Oba Ademola II. Through a series of marches involving tens of thousands of women, a refusal to pay taxes, strikes, and a wide spectrum of measures of civil disobedience, the Abeokuta Women's Union forced the Alake to abdicate his throne and won women representation in the sole native authority, a committee that was granted some say in the colonial administration. These successful protests, which made waves across the nation and internationally, are often referred to historically as the Egba Women's War or the Nigerian Women's Struggle. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti also spearheaded a campaign that ensured the successful abolition of separate tax rates for Nigerian women. In recognition of the heroic leadership of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti in the fight against policies that negatively affected Nigerian women, she was given the title Lioness of Lisabi, Lisabi being the traditional hero of the Egba people. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti became known around the world for her activism. She toured many countries and met many world leaders, raising awareness about women's political and social rights. Indeed, Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, was heavily inspired by Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti in his early organizing of the Ghana Women's Association. And in her son Fela Kuti's autobiography, he describes his mother, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, and Kwame Nkrumah as being very good friends. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti had 4 children, namely Dolupo Ransome-Kuti, Dr. Olikoye Ransome-Kuti, a former health minister of Nigeria, Dr. Bekolari Ransome-Kuti, a doctor and prominent human rights activist, and finally, Fela Anikulapo Kuti, the legendary Nigerian musician and political activist. In the 1970s, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, along with her son Fela, ditched the English name Ransom and adopted the Yoruba name Anikulapo. Anikulapo is a Yoruba word that roughly translates to warrior who carries powerful protection or he who carries death in his pouch. Fela Kuti was a very vocal critic of the military government in the 70s, and this led to a very violent attack on his home residence on the 18th of February 1977. On the said date, Close to 1,000 armed soldiers surrounded and stormed Fela Kuti's home property, called the Kalakuta Republic, at a time when his mother, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, was around. During the military raid, the then 76-year-old Funmilayo Kuti was thrown from a second-floor window. Her sons, Fela and Bekolari, were also savagely beaten and severely injured. Funmilayo Kuti sustained injuries from which she never recovered and died at the General Hospital in Lagos on April 13, 1978. Her funeral was attended by thousands, and many market women and traders shut down their shops across markets in Nigeria to mark her death. The news of Funmilayo Kuti's death was reported by at least 2 Nigerian news outlets with the headline, "Fela's mom is dead." But Funmilayo Kuti was not just Fela's mother. The anti-colonial activist and feminist was in many ways the mother of the nation. Another great Nigerian woman who dedicated her life to fighting for women's rights, social justice, and Nigeria's independence is Margaret Ekpo. This incredible woman also tirelessly agitated for Nigerian independence. She became one of Nigeria's first female elected politicians and continued to push to advance the role of women while she was a politician. Indeed, Margaret Ekpo was greatly inspired by Funmilayo Kuti and considered Funmilayo to be her mentor. In 2001, the Calabar Airport was renamed the Margaret Ekpo International Airport as a tribute and in recognition of her contribution to the advancement of Nigeria. The Margaret Ekpo International Airport is the only airport in Africa to be named after a woman. The next great African woman we are going to highlight is sadly unknown to most Africans, but remains a truly inspirational figure in African history nevertheless, especially in Guinea-Bissau. Her name is Titina Sila, and she was one of the women who fought in the war for the independence of Guinea-Bissau. Titina Sila is celebrated in Guinea-Bissau as a martyr of the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence against Portugal, led by the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, also known as the PAIGC. Born in 1943, she spent her early years living under colonial domination and grew up witnessing firsthand the brutality and degradation of colonization. But very early on, Titina Sila chose to resist colonization, and at 18 years old, when she was approached by the mobilizers for the PAIGC, she made a life-altering decision to become a freedom fighter in the War of Independence. Titina Sila's organizational and leadership skills, coupled with her bravery, resulted in her being made a leader of the People's Militia Committee in the North, and also being placed in charge of many important operations that were vital to the progress of the war effort. These included distributing literature among the people, facilitating communications between local peasants and PAIGC mobilizers, recruiting people to support the liberation movement, and finally, training as a guerrilla and engaging in combat. During the early 1960s, Titina Sila established herself as a force in the liberation movement and became one of its most popular figures. In the midst of the struggle, Titina Sila married another comrade and they had 2 children, but sadly, she wouldn't live to fulfill the role of a mother. The leader of the liberation movement and Titina Sila's mentor, Amilcar Cabral, was brutally assassinated by the Portuguese colonialists in Conakry, Guinea on 20th January 1973. On her way to the funeral of Amilcar Cabral with a group of other guerrillas, Titina Sila was ambushed and killed by the Portuguese military. She was only 30 years old. After Guinea-Bissau gained independence in 1974, a monument was erected in her honor near the river Farim, where she died. And 30th January, the day of her death, is celebrated as National Women's Day in Guinea-Bissau. Several places and institutions in Guinea-Bissau are named after Titina Sila, such as the Home to Government Ministries and Foreign Missions. Titina Sila is remembered along with Amilcar Cabral and Domingos Ramos as the most famous figures of the independence struggle in Guinea-Bissau. During her short lifetime, Titina Sila proved to be a resolute and relentless freedom fighter for the liberation of Guinea-Bissau from Portuguese colonialism. Titina and Titina Sila definitely lived an exceptional life, making a difference and leaving her footprints in the sands of time. Staying in Guinea-Bissau, another great African woman who deserves to be celebrated is Carmen Maria de Arau Pereira. Not only was Carmen Pereira involved in the liberation struggle with the PAIGC, she also became the first African woman to become president, albeit for a very short time, as president of Guinea-Bissau in 1984. From Guinea-Bissau, we turn the spotlight to Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. Yes, it is common knowledge that Ghana's fight for independence was led by Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, but the fight was highly unlikely to be successful without the contribution of a great Ghanaian woman called Naa Dedei. Born in 1923, Naa Dedei at the age of 30 became very popular for her exploits in the flower business and had won for herself the title Flower Queen, leading the Market Women Association. Known popularly as Dedei Ashikishan, she was a political activist, a devout feminist, and the chief financier of Kwame Nkrumah's political party, the Convention People's Party. Naa Dedei campaigned and also funded Kwame Nkrumah's first political campaign, which saw him win the Accra Central seat in the 1951 elections. During the campaign for the elections, Kwame Nkrumah had been jailed by the colonial government and kept in James Fort prison. Kwame Nkrumah's aide and later finance minister, Komlagbedema, is credited with organizing the campaign, and he mobilized the market women as the backbone of the CPP in Accra. The leader of those market women was Naa Dedei. Using a massive influence amongst the women of Accra, Naa Dedei was able to mobilize all the market women and traders in Accra to vote massively for Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. This resulted in a massive win for Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP in the 1951 elections. Historians consider this first political victory for Nkrumah and the CPP as very important, as it served as a launch pad to push forward and strengthen Ghana's fight for independence. Naa Dedei was a true nationalist who looked beyond ethnic considerations and placed the national interest of Ghana first. This is exemplified by her decision to support a non-native, Nkrumah, run for the Accra Central seat over a native and her fellow kinsman. This generated much hatred for her from some natives, as they felt that she had to support one of her own and not Nkrumah. But Naa Dedei was undeterred and continued to give unflinching support to Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP. Her home was said to be the unofficial headquarters for the CPP Women's Wing. Eventually, Naa Dedei became a target of opposition political parties and the colonial government due to her closeness with Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And after living to see her beloved Ghana become independent in 1957 and a republic in 1960, Naa Dedei died tragically at a CPP function on the 22nd of June 1961 at the age of 38. She was suspected to have suffered food poisoning. At her funeral, Kwame Nkrumah, who was very close to Naa Dedei, is said to have wept like a baby. In 2007, when the Ghanaian government rolled out the redenomination of the Ghanaian currency, the 50 peso coin had the face of Naa Dedei embossed on it. Her image was also used for a national stamp. All of this was done as a tribute to Naa Dedei and as a recognition for her contributions to Ghana. Double-decker buses that operated in Ghana at a point were also named after her. The buses were known as Auntie Dedei. From Ghana, we head over to the southern African country of Mozambique, where we will shine a light on a heroine of Mozambique's freedom struggle, Josina Machel. In 1958, and at 13 years old, Josina Machel entered a commercial school to pursue accounting. 2 years later, she joined a clandestine student political group, and it is with this organization that her political consciousness was developed. Once Josina turned 18 years, she fled the country with 8 other students to join the Tanzania-based Mozambique Liberation Front, FRELIMO. FRELIMO was the liberation movement that fought tirelessly for the independence of Mozambique from the Portuguese. Josina's attempt to flee with her friends were unsuccessful, and she eventually ended up in jail. She was released from jail as a result of an international campaign carried out by the FRELIMO. 4 months after Josina was released, she fled Mozambique for the second time again with a group of fellow students. From this point onwards, Josina never saw any member of her family again. After a long trip that saw them go through Swaziland, South Africa, Zambia, Josina Machel and her group eventually arrived in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, feeling undernourished and weak. But the goal of joining the ranks of liberation fighters had been achieved. As Josina reached her 20th birthday, she was assigned responsibilities within FRELIMO's multifaceted quest for national independence. She began work at the Mozambique Institute, a residential education center for Mozambican students in Tanzania. A year and a half later, Josina Machel turned down the offer of a scholarship to undertake university studies in Switzerland and volunteered rather for FRELIMO's newly created women's branch, believing that the best way to keep track of the war was to be closely involved in it. Josina Machel's selflessness and absolute dedication to the struggle for liberation made her stand out in the liberation movement. In 1968, the women's branch evolved into a de facto social services campaign for Frelimo in the liberated areas. They organize health centers, schools, and childcare centers. It helps families whose homes have been destroyed and provides emotional support to wounded soldiers and peasant families traumatized by the warfare. Josina Machel plays a visionary role in identifying the need for childcare centers to look after children who have been orphaned or separated from their families by the war. Josina Machel is then appointed head of the women's section in Frelimo's Department of International Relations. In this position, she travels periodically to international meetings on women's rights and the role of women in development, where she uses examples of Frelimo's experiences to advocate for women's equal participation in all aspects of the development process. Josina Machel is just 24 years at this point. When Frelimo President Eduardo Mondlane is assassinated in Tanzania by Portuguese agents, Josina moves in with his wife Janet to provide comfort and company. In May of 1969, she marries Samora Machel, the man who later becomes the first president of independent Mozambique. At the end of November 1969, Josina and Samora's only child, Samora Jr., is born. In 1970, Josina began to suffer from stomach pains and weakness. She traveled to Moscow for medical attention. Doctors recommend a strict diet and rest for Josina Machel, but she returns to her duties with Frelimo. At the end of the year, she leaves her son with a friend and undertakes a 2-month trip, largely on foot, to assess conditions and plan activities for the Department of Social Affairs. In March 1971, Josina Machel traveled again, this time to Cabo Delgado, to evaluate social programs being implemented there. During the trips, she struggles with chronic fatigue and exhaustion. Having become very thin and feeling tired, she decides to return to Dar es Salaam at the beginning of April. As Josina Machel crosses the border into Tanzania, she hands over her pistol to a companion and says, "Comrades, I can continue no longer. Give this to the military commander of the province so that it may contribute to the salvation of the Mozambican people." In Dar es Salaam, Josina Machel became seriously ill and was taken to the hospital, but she died on the 7th of April 1971 at the age of 25 years. A year later, Frelimo declared April 7th, the day of Josina's death, as National Women's Day in Mozambique. The principal secondary school in the capital city, Maputo, is also named after her. Sadly, Josina Machel did not live long enough to see her dear country attain independence, but her selflessness and sacrifice for the freedom of all Mozambicans mean that her memory is forever immortalized in African history. Still staying in the southern part of Africa, the next great African woman this video shall focus on is Winnie Mandela, a truly undisputed icon of South Africa's fight against apartheid. Winnie Mandela embodied the struggle and is undoubtedly a heroine of the victory against apartheid. Winnie Mandela was born in Eastern Cape's Bizana town in 1936. She moved to Johannesburg in 1953 to pursue studies in social work before meeting Nelson Mandela, her future husband, who was then an anti-apartheid campaigner. It is worth pointing out at this point that Winnie Mandela was already politically interested and involved in activism long before she met her future husband, Nelson Mandela. They were married for 38 years, but most of it was spent apart, with Nelson Mandela spending 27 of those behind bars, leaving her to raise their 2 daughters alone as she kept their dream of a free and equal South Africa alive. Winnie Mandela had very early experiences of the brutal and unjust conditions of living under apartheid. In 1945, when she was only 9 years old, Winnie Mandela had her first conscious experience of the injustices of racism and apartheid in South Africa. News had just arrived in her town of Bizana that the Second World War had ended and celebrations had been scheduled. Along with her siblings, Winnie Mandela begged their father to attend, and he eventually agreed to their demand. However, upon arriving at the town hall, it was discovered that these celebrations were for the whites only, and the children were forced to remain outside with their father, while the white population enjoyed the merriment inside. This obvious injustice struck a deep blow to Winnie Mandela, and thereafter she became very aware of the inequality of the world around her. Winnie Mandela went on to complete her degree in social work in 1955, finishing at the top of her class, and was offered a scholarship for further study in the USA. Winnie Mandela rejected this offer, choosing to stay and pursue her dream of becoming a social worker in South Africa. In July of 1958, Winnie Mandela found out that she was pregnant with her first child. But despite being pregnant, in October 1958, Winnie Mandela took part in a mass action which mobilized women to protest against the apartheid government's infamous pass laws. During the protest, police arrested 1,000 women, which included Winnie Mandela. A decision was taken by the arrested women not to apply for immediate bail, but to rather spend 2 weeks in prison as a sign of further protest. During these weeks in prison, the pregnant Winnie Mandela saw firsthand the squalid conditions of South Africa's prisons, and her commitment to the struggle only intensified. Eventually, Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo were called to arrange their bail, which led to their release. The role Winnie Mandela played in these events took her out of her husband's considerable shadow in the eyes of the public, but it was also one which alerted the national security to her potency as a voice for political dissent, independent of her famous husband. Shortly afterwards, she was sacked from her post at the hospital she worked. Following the trauma of incarceration, on the 4th of February 1959, Winnie Mandela gave birth to a daughter she named Zenani. Despite the arrest and imprisonment of her husband Nelson, Winnie Mandela continued to campaign against apartheid, and this got her into trouble with the apartheid government severally. For instance, she was handed multiple banning orders by the apartheid government. These orders were very harsh and they severely limited her movements from dusk to dawn. In fact, one of the banning orders prevented her from moving anywhere other than her neighborhood, and another banning order saw her moved far away from her home to a remote town. All of these cruel acts by the apartheid government had several ramifications, including the necessity for her to give up her job as a social worker. Subsequently, she was forced out of job after job by the police, who approached anyone who was bold enough to give her employment and forced them to fire her. Due to Winnie Mandela's continued struggles, which included difficulty in finding a school for her daughters, she was eventually forced to send them away to Swaziland, and with the help of friends, managed to find a school for them. Winnie Mandela suffered her first major spell of imprisonment in May 1969, having been arrested supposedly for political agitation. Her treatment by the apartheid police was beyond appalling. She was held for 17 months, most of it in solitary confinement. Winnie Mandela was interrogated and kept awake for up to 5 days at a time. All of this had dire consequences on her health, and she landed up in a prison hospital, suffering from malnutrition. After she was released from jail, Winnie Mandela recognized the brutalizing effect the experience had on her, telling a television interviewer many years later, "I knew what it is to hate." Whilst Nelson Mandela and his ANC comrades were in jail on Robben Island, Winnie Mandela found herself at the center of the anti-apartheid struggle. As a result, the police raids on her home were relentless, with intrusions into her home sometimes happening up to 4 times a day. Her home was routinely burgled, vandalized, and even bombed. Up until the 1970s, the years of constant police harassment, jail time, and intimidation had done absolutely nothing to quash Winnie Mandela's revolutionary spirit. Indeed, her conviction had only become stronger. Her message to the authorities was clear: you cannot intimidate people like me anymore. In 1977, the state subjected Winnie Mandela to internal exile, banning her to the town of Brantford, more than 4 hours drive from her home in Soweto. The story of her Brantford years was one of hardship, suffering, loneliness, and courage. The police kept her under intense open surveillance to a degree which suggested that persecution, not surveillance, was the intention. Despite all the persecution Winnie Mandela faced, she never wavered in her resolute determination to fight to liberate South Africa, and this became the reality in 1994, when white minority rule came to an end and a free South Africa was born. On the 2nd of April 2018, Winnie Madikizela Mandela passed away in Johannesburg at the age of 81. In paying tribute to Winnie Mandela, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said, "The death of Winnie Mandela is a great loss in that she has been one of the strongest women in our struggle who suffered immensely under the apartheid regime. She remained strong, she remained determined, she was courageous, and in many ways she was also very stubborn. Stubborn on behalf of our people, because she knew that out of stubborn disposition, she would be able to inspire millions of South Africans." Tens of thousands of South Africans attended the funeral of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, and the United Nations staged a special memorial sitting at its New York headquarters to mark her passing. Finally, another truly great African woman everybody needs to know about is the legendary South African singer, Miriam Makeba. Known popularly as Mama Africa, Miriam Makeba was also a civil rights and anti-apartheid activist. She was a very strong advocate against apartheid and was among the most visible people campaigning against the apartheid system in South Africa. Also, Miriam Makeba was responsible for popularizing several anti-apartheid songs, using her vocal talents to fight injustice in her country. Due to her popularity, she became a spokesperson of sorts for Black South Africans living under apartheid. Miriam Makeba delivered anti-apartheid speeches at the United Nations in 1963 and again in 1976. In 1963, during an appearance before the United Nations Special Committee on Apartheid, she called for a boycott of South Africa. The apartheid regime responded by banning her music records in South Africa. Due to Miriam Makeba's international campaigns against apartheid, she was prevented by the South African government from returning to her country and was forced to live in exile for 31 years. This made her a symbol of apartheid's cruelty. In the early 90s, when apartheid came to an end, Nelson Mandela persuaded Miriam Makeba to return home to South Africa, where she lived for the rest of her life. In an interview he granted in the year 2000, the legendary South African musician Hugh Masekela said that there is nobody in Africa who made the world more aware of what was happening in South Africa than Miriam Makeba. On the 9th of November 2008, Miriam Makeba fell ill during a concert in Italy and subsequently passed away. In paying tribute to Miriam Makeba, former South African President Nelson Mandela said, "Her music inspired a powerful sense of hope in all of us. She was a mother to our struggle and to the young nation of ours." Miriam Makeba was also a strong Pan-Africanist and called for unity between Black people of African descent across the world, declaring that Africans who live everywhere should fight everywhere. The struggle is no different in South Africa, the streets of Chicago, Trinidad or Canada. In ending, it is my hope that the objective of this video, which is to highlight the heroic acts and sacrifices by these wonderful African women, has been successfully achieved. Learning about how young Titina Sila and Josina Machel in particular were, provided me with a lot of inspiration as a young African, and it is my hope that every African youth who watches this video will be positively impacted as well. For all of us as Africans, the least we can do is to always remember these great women and to give them our highest respect. Thank you so much for watching. Please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and please don't forget to share with others.